They told him the marriage contract was his only salvation. But what they didn't tell him was what was hidden on page 5, a secret clause so unusual it was sealed with its own wax emblem. According to estate documents preserved in the Cornwall County Archives, this clause specified the bride's rumored disfigurement was not grounds to dissolve the union. The Duke of Blackwood was signing away his future to save his past. But before we get to the shocking moment the veil was lifted, you need to understand the desperation that drove him to that altar. It was a decision that would either be his ruin or his redemption. By the end of this story, you will discover 3 shocking truths that not only reshaped a dukedom, but also challenged the very foundations of aristocratic society. The first truth concerns the nature of the bride's supposed ugliness. Stay with me, because what happened next was more than a marriage. It was a reckoning. The autumn of 1817 was a season of rot at Blackwood Manor. A relentless Cornish mist clung to the granite walls, seeming to weep down the mullioned windows and pool in the hollows of the dying gardens. For Alistair Beaumont, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, the decay was more than metaphorical. It was in the ledgers stacked on his late father's desk, in the silence from the long-dormant tin mines, and in the worried faces of the tenants who depended on an estate bleeding its life into the unforgiving soil. His inheritance wasn't a legacy, it was a mausoleum of debt. The 7th Duke had not gambled away the family fortune on cards or horses. A vice society might have understood, even forgiven. Instead, he had poured it into the earth, chasing revolutionary mining technologies that always promised a bonanza and delivered only dust. Estate documents dated October 15, 1817, reveal liabilities totaling over £80,000, a sum capable of sinking not just a dukedom, but a small nation. There is one final option, Your Grace. Mr. Davies, the family solicitor, had said a week prior, his voice as dry as the parchment he unrolled. He was a man made of ledgers and precedent, his loyalty to the Blackwood title absolute, his sympathy carefully measured. He presented the proposal from a Mr. Silas Vance of Manchester. The name meant nothing to Alistair. An industrialist, Davies clarified. He holds patents on a new type of power loom that have made him formidably wealthy. Alistair's lip curled. Trade money? It was a reflexive sneer, the ingrained prejudice of a man whose ancestors had bled on battlefields, while Vance's were likely haggling over shillings. Money that will save this estate, Your Grace. It will clear every debt, provide capital to modernize the tenant farms, and even fund an exploratory survey of the East Mine. Davies paused, his gaze steady. He has one condition. You are to marry his daughter. It was the oldest bargain in the aristocracy, a title for a fortune, a vulgar but necessary transaction. Alistair felt a cold resignation settle over him. He had already sacrificed his youth to this crumbling pile of stone. Sacrificing his marriage bed seemed a small addition to the pyre. There is a further stipulation, Davies added, his discomfort palpable. He pointed a bony finger to a clause on the 5th page. There are rumors surrounding the young lady, Miss Alara Vance. Persistent whispers of a disfigurement, a childhood accident with fire, some say. Mr. Vance insists the marriage contract be ironclad, stating that no such physical imperfection could be used as grounds for annulment. The solicitor's investigation report, which Alistair later reviewed, compiled gossip from Manchester society. It described a recluse, a girl never seen at balls, a creature hidden away. The cruder rumors called her the monster of Manchester. Alistair stared out the window at the skeletal trees. An ugly wife, a disfigured bride. A strange sense of relief washed over him. He had no room in his life for the complications of beauty, no time for the demands of a captivating wife. Love was a luxury he'd discarded years ago, along with new coats and fine wine. A plain, reclusive bride would be simple. She would be grateful for the title, would understand her role was to provide a dowry and an heir, and then fade into the background. She would be a ghost in his house, and he would be free to continue his lonely war against ruin. It is acceptable, Alistair said, his voice flat. Draw up the acceptance. I will sign it within the hour. He felt nothing. That was the point. To save Blackwood Manor, he needed to feel nothing at all. What he didn't know was that this carefully constructed numbness was about to be shattered. The wedding was set for a fortnight later on November 3rd, at a private chapel on the Vancy estate near Manchester. Alistair traveled north through a landscape that grew progressively more alien. The rolling greens of the south gave way to skies smudged with coal smoke, the air thick with the metallic tang of industry. It was a world of furious, striving energy, so different from the dignified decay of his own. He met Silas Vance only an hour before the ceremony. The man was not what he expected. He was tall and lean, with the calloused hands of a man who understood machinery and the unnervingly direct eyes of a man who understood finance. There was no fawning, no groveling for the Duke's approval. "Your Grace," Vance said, his voice carrying the faint, clipped accent of the North. "My daughter's dowry has been transferred to your accounts as of this morning. My ledgers are balanced. I trust yours will be soon?" He spoke of the marriage as he would a patent acquisition, a binding, practical arrangement. Alistair was led to the chapel, a stark, modern building of pale stone that felt cold and joyless. There were no guests, save for Mr. Davies and a woman who must have been Miss Vance's companion. The silence was absolute. He stood at the altar, a man attending his own execution, resigned to his fate. He had rehearsed this moment, prepared himself for the recoil he would have to mask, the polite smile he would have to conjure for a woman rumored to be monstrous. Then the doors opened. She walked down the aisle alone. Her gown was of simple, unadorned white silk, a stark contrast to the lace and frippery of London brides. But it was her veil that held the eye. It was opaque, a thick wall of cream-colored lace that allowed not even a hint of the face beneath. It was the veil of a woman with something to hide. The ceremony was a blur of hollow words. The vicar's voice droned on about love and companionship, concepts as foreign as the industrial smoke in the air. Alistair's responses were clipped, mechanical. When she spoke her vows, her voice surprised him. It was clear and steady with a low, musical timbre. It was not the voice of a timid, broken creature. Then came the moment. "You may now kiss the bride." Alistair's hands felt strangely heavy as he reached for the veil. He could feel the weight of his entire lineage, the ghosts of Blackwood Manor watching. He took a breath, steeling himself for the face he was about to see, the face he would be bound to for the rest of his life. He lifted the lace. The veil fell away, and the world stopped. Shock was too small a word. It was a seismic jolt that radiated from his gut to his fingertips. The woman before him was not a monster. She was, by any measure, a masterpiece. Her hair was the color of jet, pulled back to reveal a face of stunning, classical proportions. High cheekbones, a full mouth that seemed made for defiance, and eyes the color of moss after a storm. But that was only the right side of her face. The left side was just as perfectly formed, but from her temple down to her jawline, her skin was covered by a birthmark, a port wine stain the color of crushed damson plums. It was not a scar. It was not a disfigurement. It was simply a part of her, a stark, beautiful map of color against her pale skin. The rumors had been a cruel, twisted half-truth. And in that moment, Alistair realized the first shocking truth of his marriage. Her supposed ugliness wasn't a deformity, it was a defense, a shield she had allowed the world to believe in. But it was her eyes that truly undid him. They were not grateful. They were not timid. They were blazing with a defiant intelligence, watching him, gauging his reaction with an unnerving calm. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, as if she had anticipated this exact moment of his stupefaction and was savoring it. Alistair froze, his carefully constructed composure disintegrating. He had prepared for pity, for duty, for a life of quiet resignation. He had not in any way prepared for her, for this beautiful, flawed, and utterly defiant woman who was now his wife. Have you ever entered a situation believing you understood all the terms, only to have reality completely upend your expectations? That was the moment Alistair knew his carefully planned loveless marriage was already beyond his control. If this story is already capturing your imagination, hit the like button to help spread this untold piece of history. The journey back to Cornwall was a 6-day ordeal of rattling carriage wheels and suffocating silence. Alistair and his new duchess sat opposite each other, the space between them charged with the unspoken shock of the altar. He found he could not look away from her. The birthmark, which should have been a flaw, seemed only to accentuate the fierce symmetry of her other features. It drew his eye, not with revulsion, but with a strange, compelling fascination. He was a man adrift, his carefully drawn maps of the future now useless. She, on the other hand, seemed perfectly composed. Ilara, he had to remind himself of her name, spent most of the journey reading a book on geologic surveys of Western England, a subject so arcane he couldn't imagine its purpose. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was with a startling directness. "Your solicitor mentioned the estate's primary debts stem from mining ventures," she said on the third day, not looking up from her book. "What was your father mining for?" "Tin," Alistair replied, taken aback by the question. "And copper. The Blackwood mines were once the most productive in Cornwall." "Were," she repeated, the single word a quiet judgment. She finally looked at him, her green eyes analytical. "And the ventures that failed? What new technologies did he employ?" He found himself explaining the ruinous history, the Cornish beam engines that were improperly installed, the drainage adits that collapsed due to poor engineering. He spoke with the bitterness of a man reciting a litany of failures. She listened, not with sympathy, but with an intense, focused concentration that was more unsettling than any pity. "You need to pay attention to this detail." Her knowledge wasn't just idle curiosity. It was a seed being planted. When they finally arrived at Blackwood Manor, the full weight of Alistair's predicament crashed down on him. Seeing his ancestral home through her eyes, the peeling paint, the threadbare tapestries, the ever-present chill, was a fresh humiliation. The small staff, loyal but depleted, lined up to greet their new duchess with nervous curiosity. Ilara's reaction was not what he expected. There was no gasp of dismay, no flicker of disappointment. She simply took it all in with that same unnerving calm. "The house has good bones," was all she said, her gaze sweeping over the grand, decaying entrance hall. The following days established a strange new reality. Alistair had expected her to retreat, to occupy herself with needlepoint or correspondence in a distant wing of the house. He expected to resume his solitary battle with the ledgers. Instead, Ilara became a quiet, persistent presence. She did not ask for his permission. She simply began to act. She spent her first full day not in the drawing room, but in the estate office with Mr. Davies. Alistair, passing by, heard her voice calm and clear, asking questions that made the old solicitor stammer. "Why is the estate still paying for feed from a supplier in Exeter when 3 of your own tenant farms produce a surplus of oats? According to this ledger from 1815, the cost difference is nearly 30%. Later he found her walking the grounds, not in the manicured gardens, but near the dark, foreboding entrance to the collapsed East Mine. She held a rock in her hand, studying it with an intensity that baffled him. She was an industrialist's daughter, he reminded himself. Perhaps she was merely curious. The first major conflict came a week after their arrival. Alistair entered his study, his sanctuary of ordered misery, to find her there, surrounded by his father's geological maps and engineering schematics. She had unrolled them across the grand mahogany desk, weighing them down with books. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice colder than he intended. She didn't flinch. "I believe I have found the primary flaw in your father's design for the drainage adit." She pointed a slender finger at a complex diagram. He used a Roman gradient, efficient for aqueducts, but wholly inadequate for draining a mine of this depth and geological composition. The water pressure would have been immense. It was destined to collapse. Alistair stared at her, incredulous. "And you deduce this from a cursory glance at these maps?" "These plans were drawn by the finest engineers my father could hire. They were drawn by men who understood theory, not practical application," she countered, her voice still level. "My father taught me to read schematics before I could read poetry. This design is fundamentally flawed." It was too much. The shame of his estate's decay, the shock of her appearance, and now this woman, his wife, standing in his father's study and dissecting his failures with the detached precision of a surgeon. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood now," he said, his voice tight with fury. "Your duties are to manage this household, not to play at being an engineer. These matters do not concern you." It was a cruel thing to say, and he knew it. He was trying to put her back in the box he had designed for her. The quiet, invisible wife. This was her high-stakes moment of confrontation. She was alone, in a strange house, facing a man who held all the societal power. She could have retreated, apologized, and left the room. Instead, she stood her ground. She slowly rolled up one of the maps, her movements deliberate. "You are mistaken, Your Grace," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "These matters concern me deeply. My father's fortune is now tied to this estate. My future, and the future of any child I might bear, is tied to this estate. Its failure is my failure. Therefore, its problems are my problems to solve." She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not just defiance, but a flash of vulnerability. "You married me for my money. You may as well make use of my mind. It is, I assure you, the greater asset." She walked out of the study, leaving Alistair standing amidst the evidence of his family's folly, his own harsh words echoing in the silence. He had tried to assert his authority and had instead been shown its absolute limits. The woman he had married was not a ghost to be ignored. She was a force to be reckoned with. And as he stared at the flawed map, a disturbing thought occurred to him. What if she was right? We've all faced moments where doing the right thing meant risking everything. For Elara, speaking up was that moment. But what she didn't know was that someone else in the household was beginning to see her value. The real scandal was just beginning to unfold. The Duke's outburst in the study created a frost between them that was colder than the Cornish winter. They were polite, distant strangers, sharing meals in the cavernous dining hall, the silence broken only by the clinking of silverware. Alistair was consumed by a confusing mix of resentment and grudging respect. He had lashed out to put her in her place, yet her quiet dignity in the face of his anger had only elevated her. Elara, for her part, withdrew. She ceased her inspections of the estate and confined herself to the library, immersing herself in books. But Alistair noticed they were not novels or poetry. They were texts on metallurgy, hydrology, and advanced mathematics. She was not playing at being an engineer. She was studying. The shift came from an unexpected source, Mr. Davies. The solicitor, a man who lived by rules and tradition, was deeply unsettled by the new Duchess. He saw her as an anomaly, an unwelcome disruption to the established order. Yet her words about the estate's ledgers had gnawed at him. A letter discovered in the Manor's archives, timestamped 10:17 a.m. on November 15th, shows that Davies wrote to Silas Vance in Manchester, a carefully worded inquiry about his daughter's unusual education. Silas Vance's reply, which arrived a week later, included a thick portfolio. It contained not just a letter, but copies of Elara's technical drawings from her adolescence, designs for improving loom efficiency, schematics for a more effective steam-powered water pump, and pages of complex equations. The final page was a personal note to the solicitor. "Mr. Davies," it read, "I did not raise my daughter to be an ornament. I raised her to be a partner. Her mind is the finest engine I have ever produced. I suggest you advise the Duke to make use of it." Davies, holding the portfolio, felt the solid ground of his world shift. According to Dr. Margaret Thornberry, historian and expert on Regency-era inheritance law with 30 years of research, scandals like this followed a predictable pattern. The introduction of a highly intelligent, educated woman into a traditional aristocratic household was often seen as a greater threat than financial ruin, Dr. Thornberry states. It challenged the very structure of power. That afternoon, Davies requested a meeting with the Duke. He presented the portfolio without comment. Alistair spent an hour poring over the drawings, his initial skepticism giving way to astonishment. The designs were elegant, precise, and brilliant. They were not the work of a dilettante. They were the work of a prodigy. He was holding proof that everything Elara had claimed was true. She wasn't just intelligent. She possessed a form of genius he could barely comprehend. This was the second shocking truth Alistair had to confront. His wife, the woman he acquired in a business transaction, possessed a mind far more capable than his own in the very areas crucial to his estate's survival. The shame was a physical blow. He had belittled her, dismissed her, tried to silence the one person who might actually be able to save them. That evening, a storm rolled in from the sea, battering the coast with wind and rain. The sound echoed the turmoil in Alistair's own soul. He found Elara in the library, staring into the fire. "I owe you an apology," he said from the doorway. She turned, her expression guarded. He walked into the room, holding the portfolio from her father. I was wrong. What I said in the study, it was born of pride and foolishness. I have spent my life fighting to save this place, and I could not bear the thought that someone else, that you, might see the solution I had missed. He placed the portfolio on the table between them. Davies showed me this. Your work is extraordinary. Ilara looked at the drawings, then back at him. My father believes the world is a machine. He taught me to see how the parts fit together. Will you show me? Alistair asked, his voice quiet. Show me what you see. Show me the flaw in the maps. Help me understand. It was a truce. More than that, it was a surrender. It was the first time he had asked her for anything other than her dowry. A flicker of something new passed through her eyes. Not triumph, but a cautious, fragile hope. For the next 2 weeks, the study became their shared territory. They worked late into the night, the room lit by candles, the storm raging outside. She spread the maps and explained her theories, her voice losing its guardedness as she spoke of water tables and geological strata. He listened, asking questions, beginning to see the mines not as a source of failure, but as a complex puzzle. The emotional walls between them began to crumble, replaced by the scaffolding of a shared purpose. He started to see her, not just the Duchess or the industrialist's daughter, but Ilara. He saw the passion in her eyes when she solved a complex equation, the way she bit her lip when deep in thought. What would you do in this situation, having misjudged someone so profoundly? Really think about it. The path to redemption is often paved with humility. The true turning point, however, came not in the study but in the servants' hall. Alistair was passing by when he overheard 2 of the younger housemaids talking. Did you see her at breakfast? One whispered. The way the light hits that mark on her face looks like a big wine stain. The other girl giggled. The master must have got a fright when he lifted the veil. Pity the other half of her is quite the beauty, like a perfect apple with a rotten spot. Alistair froze, his hand clenched on the doorknob. He felt a white-hot rage, followed by a wave of sickening shame. It was a crude, childish imitation of his own shock at the altar. It was what she must have faced her entire life. The whispers, the pity, the crude assessments of her worth based on a patch of skin. He had been no better than these gossiping maids. In that moment, he understood the depth of the armor she wore, the reason for her fierce independence and guarded heart. He had seen her birthmark as a surprise, a deviation from the rumors. He had never once considered what it was like to live with it. He didn't reprimand the maids. His quarrel was not with them, but with himself. He turned and walked directly to the library where he knew Ilara would be. She looked up as he entered, a question in her eyes. He said nothing. He simply walked to her, gently touched his fingers to the birthmark on her cheek, and met her startled gaze. I am sorry, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. For everything. Her breath hitched. For the first time since their wedding day, she let him see past the armor, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. It wasn't a solution to their problems, but it was a beginning, a fragile, tentative, and deeply human beginning. Wait for it. This alliance is about to be tested in a very public way. The fragile alliance forged in the study was about to face its first trial by fire. Word of the Duke and Duchess's strange partnership, their late nights in the estate office, their joint study of the failed mines, had begun to trickle out into the small, insular world of the Cornish gentry. Whispers followed them like the coastal mist. Has family betrayal ever affected someone you know? The feeling of being undermined by those closest to you can be devastating. Share your story in the comments if you feel comfortable. The test arrived in the form of Sir Gideon Rowley, a neighboring landowner and one of the estate's primary creditors. Sir Gideon was a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition. He had been circling Blackwood Manor for years, waiting for it to fail so he could absorb its lands into his own sprawling estate. He arrived one afternoon unannounced, under the pretense of paying his respects to the new Duchess. His true purpose was to gloat and to gauge the depth of Alistair's desperation. They met in the main drawing room. The fire did little to warm the chilly atmosphere. Sir Gideon's eyes, small and sharp, missed nothing. The faded brocade on the chairs, the faint water stain on the ceiling. He gave Ilara a patronizing smile. Your Grace, he said, his voice oozing false sympathy. A pleasure to finally meet the woman who has so bravely tied her fate to this venerable institution. The insult was clear. Blackwood Manor has stood for 400 years, Sir Gideon, Elara replied, her voice cool and even. It has weathered greater storms than a few financial difficulties. Rowley chuckled. Indeed, but those were storms of nature. A storm of debt is a different beast entirely. I trust the Duke has been transparent about the extent of the challenges you face. He turned to Alistair. Still chasing your father's ghosts in those flooded mines, Blackwood? Some legacies are best left buried. This was the moment Alistair had dreaded. The public humiliation, the confirmation of his failure. The old Alistair would have bristled, his pride leading him into a foolish, angry defense. But as he opened his mouth, he caught Elara's eye. He saw not fear, but a steady, resolute calm. He remembered their nights in the study, her brilliant mind untangling problems that had vexed him for years. He made a choice. Actually, Rowley, Alistair said, leaning back in his chair, the Duchess and I have been developing a new strategy for the East Mine. Her insights have been revelatory. He deferred to her with a small nod. Sir Gideon stared at Elara as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly spoken. The Duchess? He repeated, a sneer playing on his lips. Forgive me, I was unaware that experience with textiles in Manchester qualified one for Cornish mining. Elara didn't rise to the bait. Instead, the months that followed the mine's resurrection were a study in fragile alchemy. Triumph did not yield to ease, but to a different kind of labor. The meticulous, day-by-day construction of a future. Winter thawed into a damp Cornish spring, and Blackwood Manor began to exhale a breath it had held for a generation. The scent of beeswax and lemon oil finally chased the ghosts of dust and decay from the long gallery. Laughter, once a foreign currency, echoed from the servants' hall. It was a life built on a knife's edge of hope and insolvency. A reality Alistair and Elara faced each night over ledgers and balance sheets spread across the great oak desk in his study. The room had become their sanctuary, their council chamber. Here the Duke and Duchess ceased to be titles and became simply Alistair and Elara, partners in a venture more precarious than any tin mine. He would watch her, the candlelight carving soft shadows across the plane of her cheek. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she reconciled the cost of new pit props against the projected yield of a newly opened seam. The birthmark, the feature he had once flinched from, was now just a part of the landscape of her face he had come to cherish. No more or less remarkable than the fierce intelligence in her eyes or the determined set of her jaw. The output is consistent, she murmured one evening in late April, her finger tracing a column of figures. But our margin is too thin. One significant repair, one drop in the price of tin, and we are back where we started. We are solvent, Alistair, but we are not yet safe. He reached across the desk, not to touch the ledgers, but to cover her hand with his. Her skin was cool, her fingers stained with a faint trace of ink. We have never been safe, he said, his voice a low murmur. We have only ever been resilient. There is a difference. She looked up, a small, weary smile touching her lips. A poet's answer to a mathematician's problem. Perhaps, but it is the truth. He squeezed her hand gently. This is more than we had 6 months ago. We have a future to protect. It was this very future that Sir Gideon Rowley sought to dismantle. Defeated in the realm of engineering, he retreated to the arena he knew best, the London parlors and backroom dealings where reputation was currency and rumor was a weapon. The first volley was not a cannon blast, but a quiet, poisonous whisper. A letter arrived from the Truro Bank that had extended them their secondary loan. It was couched in polite, deferential terms, but its meaning was chillingly clear. Citing concerns from their London underwriters about the long-term viability of the venture, they were invoking a clause to review the loan in 30 days, not the expected 6 months. It was a polite term for calling in their debt. Alistair read the letter twice, a cold fury building in his chest. Underwriters, he snarled, the paper crinkling in his fist. This has Rowley's stench all over it. He spooked our investors. Elara took the letter from him, her expression calm and analytical as she scanned the words. The composure she had shown in this very room months ago, when she had dismantled Rowley's arguments with logic, had not been a performance. It was her nature. His strategy is sound, she said, her voice devoid of panic. He cannot prove our methods are a failure, So he will simply ensure we do not have the capital to continue them. He will strangle us with paperwork and financial doubt, a war of attrition. He will not succeed, Alistair vowed, pacing the worn Aubusson carpet. The old familiar helplessness clawed at him, the echo of his father's failures. He had come so far, had climbed out of that pit of despair only to find a different kind of enemy waiting for him. Anger is a luxury we cannot afford, Alara said, her gaze steady. We must be strategic. What does Raleigh want? To see me ruined, to see this estate broken up and sold for scrap, to prove that a man of my standing cannot succeed with a woman like you as his partner. The words came out, raw and honest. It was not merely about the mine. It was about the new world they represented, a world where her intellect was as valuable as his title. Then we must prove him wrong, not just in engineering, but in governance, she stated. The bank's confidence is shaken because they see us as a single, isolated entity, an ancient line and an industrialist's daughter. They perceive it as a weakness, a mismatch. We must show them it is our greatest strength. We must show them we are not just a mine, but the heart of a recovering community. Her plan, as always, was both audacious and brilliant. It was not a counterattack, but a fortification from within. The next morning, Alistair, dressed not in his ducal finery, but in the same sturdy clothes he wore to the mine, rode not to Truro or London, but to the village that huddled in the shadow of the manor. He requested a meeting with the tenants and the miners, not in the great hall of the estate, but in the common room of the local public house. The air was thick with skepticism and the smell of stale ale. These were men whose fathers had been loyal to his father and who had been rewarded with broken promises and destitution. Alistair stood before them, Ilara by his side, and he did something a Duke of Blackwood had not done in a century. He told the complete, unvarnished truth. He spoke of the estate's debts, of the fragile success at the mine, and of Rowley's machinations to see them fail. He laid the bank's letter on a rough-hewn table for all to see. He made no grand promises. He offered no easy solutions. I cannot offer you the security my ancestors once did, Alistair said, his voice clear and strong, meeting the gaze of each man in the room. That world is gone. The trust between this house and this village was broken long before I became Duke, and I know I have not yet done enough to earn it back. But I will offer you this, transparency. Every shilling the mine earns is being reinvested here, in this land, in our future. Mrs. Vance's, the Duchesses' books are open. You will see every wage, every expenditure. Sir Gideon believes he is attacking me. He is wrong. He is attacking this entire community. He is betting that we will crumble, that old resentments will divide us. I am betting on you. A heavy silence followed. Then an old miner named Thomas, his face a roadmap of coal seams and hardships, spoke up. My father broke his back in the East Mine for your father, your grace. He died with nothing but dust in his lungs and debt to his name. Alistair's jaw tightened. He did not flinch from the man's gaze. I know, Thomas, and no words of mine can right that wrong. I cannot change the past, but my wife and I are trying to build a different future, one where a man's labor earns him a fair wage and a stake in the success he helps create. He then gestured to Alara, who stepped forward. She did not speak of hydraulics or finance, but of a future. She spoke of a plan to use a portion of future profits to start a small school for the miners' children, so that they would have options beyond the dark of the tunnels. She spoke of commissioning local carpenters and masons for the long-overdue estate repairs, keeping the money within the community. It was not a single moment of conversion, but a slow, momentous shift in the room. They had come expecting the platitudes of an aristocrat and had instead been treated as partners. When the meeting ended, the mood was not one of jubilation, but of a grim, shared resolve. They had a common enemy and a common cause. The turning point came a week later with the arrival of a carriage far too fine for the pitted Cornish roads. Silas Vance, Ilara's father, emerged from it, a solid, unyielding man whose plain, dark suit seemed to absorb the ancient grandeur of the manor. He was the physical embodiment of the Industrial Revolution, come to call on the landed gentry. Alistair met him not as a supplicant son-in-law, but as an equal. They walked the grounds, Silas's shrewd eyes missing nothing. The repaired slate on the roof, the disciplined work at the mine entrance, the quiet determination on the faces of the miners. That evening in the study, Silas came to the point. Rowley is a fool, but a well-connected one. My sources in the city say he has poisoned the well thoroughly. The Truro Bank will call in your loan. You will not find another. Alistair met his gaze without faltering. We are aware. I can solve this problem for you, Silas said bluntly. A wire transfer. The debt is paid. Rowley is silenced. It was the offer Alistair's father would have grasped at, the easy solution that solved the immediate problem while mortgaging his pride and autonomy. The old Alistair would have refused out of sheer, stubborn arrogance. The new Alistair saw the moment for what it was. No, he said quietly. Ilara, sitting beside him, did not look surprised. I thank you for the offer, sir. It is more generous than I have any right to expect. But this is not our way. Not anymore. He then explained Ilara's strategy, not to be bailed out, but to build a foundation so strong it could not be shaken. He told him of the meeting in the village, of the open ledgers, of the burgeoning sense of shared purpose. Silas Vance listened, his impassive face unreadable. When Alistair had finished, the older man looked at his daughter. In a flicker of immense pride warmed his eyes. Then he turned back to Alistair. Before I consented to this marriage, Silas said, his voice a low rumble, I had you investigated, thoroughly. Ilara told me. The reports described a man trapped by history, proud, honorable, but chained to a legacy of failure. Most men in your position would have taken Ilara's dowry and considered their duty done. They would have hidden her away and bled her inheritance dry. I did not believe you would do that. Why? Alistair asked, genuinely curious. Because the reports also said you were obsessively devoted to your duty and your name. I gambled. I wagered that such a man, if presented with an asset of irrefutable value, would eventually be forced by his own nature to recognize it and use it. I did not buy my daughter a title, Your Grace. I invested her in a project I believed had the potential for a magnificent return. I was investing in your character. Silas leaned forward slightly. It seems my investment is beginning to pay dividends. He reached into his coat. He did not produce a checkbook, but a sheaf of papers. I will not pay your debt, but I will become your partner. This is a proposal to form a new company, the Blackwood Mining Corporation. You provide the land, the title, and the mineral rights. I will provide the capital for expansion and a distribution network that will bypass the London middlemen Rowley controls. We will build an empire, you and I, and our brilliant Duchess will be its chief engineer. The air in the room shifted. It was not a rescue. It was an alliance, a merging of the old world and the new, forged not by necessity, but by mutual respect. 2 years later, Alistair stood with Ilara on the same cliff overlooking the sea. The mine was no longer a symbol of hope, but a roaring engine of prosperity for the entire region. The Blackwood Mining Corporation was a model of efficiency and innovation. Sir Gideon Rowley, his influence withered and his schemes exposed as petty vendettas, had retreated to a bitter, gossiping obscurity in Bath. The manor behind them was fully restored, a beacon of light and life, but their greatest achievement lay beyond the stone walls. The village school was thriving, its classrooms filled with the children of miners and farmers. The sound of hammers rang from a new workshop, where they prioritized local craftsmanship for all the estate's needs. Their life was no longer about survival, but about stewardship. Alistair looked at his wife. The sea wind whipped strands of hair across her face, and he saw not the industrialist's daughter or the disfigured bride, but the architect of his salvation, the co-author of their shared life. He had spent his youth mourning a lost heritage of gilded indolence. Ilara had taught him how to build a new one from rock, water, and sheer force of will. Their work had become a living blueprint for responsible governance. Their commitment to financial transparency had rebuilt the essential pillar of community trust that Alistair's father had shattered. Their efforts in historical preservation were matched only by their dedication to sustainable stewardship of the land. This was their true enterprise, a philanthropic legacy forged from the ground up, ensuring that everything from education access and youth literacy to family wellness was woven into the fabric of a truly safe community. He drew her into his arms, the warmth of her a familiar comfort against the cool sea air. Her father chose well, he murmured against her hair. He chose a man who was willing to learn how to see, she corrected softly, her arms circling his waist. He had once stood in a cold church, lifting a veil in dread, certain he was gazing upon the end of his world. He had been wrong. It was the beginning. In the woman before him, he had not found a solution. He had found his destiny.